Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar, Protect Your Digital Business Against Today's Collaborative Fraud Ring. I am going to give folks a minute or two to get settled, so please stay on the line and we will start in just a moment. Our presentation will begin in just a moment. Please stay on the line. Hello and welcome to today's presentation, Protect Your Digital Business Against Today's Collaborative Fraud Ring. My name is DJ Murphy. I am the editor-in-chief of Card Not Present. I'm really excited for today's presentation. I've been reporting on e-commerce fraud here at Card Not Present for about 7 years, so not that long. And during that time, the way fraudsters operate has totally changed. Fraud itself has become industrialized. It has division of labor and job specialization. It has supply chains and wholesalers and retailers. It even has R&D now. E-commerce fraud is truly organized crime, and many of the bad actors, the worst of them really, that you guys face every day, are part of rings that are pushing the boundaries to figure out the best ways to steal from you. So I'm really excited to have a great panel of speakers who are going to take us through what these fraud rings are doing now, what the latest fraud trends are, and how to combat them without having a negative impact on your user experience. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Kevin Bric, Director of Partnerships at Onfido, Dimi Radu, Global Document and Fraud Expert at Onfido, and Scott Olson, who is the Vice President of Product Marketing at iovation. I'm going to turn it over to them in just a second. I did just want to remind you, please ask questions. Anything that occurs to you during the presentation, there is a question tab on your webinar software. Go to that tab and you can enter your question in there and we will get to it at the Q&A at the end. If we do not get to everybody's question at the end, someone from Onfido will get back to you offline and address your question. So feel free to ask them. Your question will be answered. Also, our webinar is being recorded today. If you miss any portion of it or you want to go back and take a look, it will be available on Card Not Present at a later date. We will email everybody that registered when that recording becomes available. So settle in for a great presentation. I'm going to turn it over right now to Kevin.
Great, thank you, DJ, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Kevin Bric. I head up our partnerships here in the Americas, and I have the pleasure of working very closely with iovation to help companies go and bust these fraudsters and protect their businesses. So real quick, what we'll be stepping through today, first I'll take you through a little bit about trends in the landscape of the digital economy as well as fraud. Dimi will then dive deeper into the fraud, kind of the common attack vectors and what we see out in the wild. We will then move over to Scott to discuss, how you build trust in this, digital world that we all live in. And then I will come back and discuss how our top customers at iovation and Onfido are balancing fraud and UX, which is a huge topic, and then we'll kick it off to DJ and the rest of us for discussion. So looking forward to a great 45 minutes here. So to jump right in, the digital economy is growing. This is no secret to any of us, very simple, very straightforward. But there's a couple metrics that we like to look at to level set here and really analyze how much is this growing, because this then helps dictate how much fraud is out there and what types of fraud that we will be seeing. So a couple key metrics. One, the global digital economy, depending on who you talk to and how it's measured, is between 12 and 15 trillion dollars today. For some reference, at about 12 billion, that's roughly the size of the GDPs of Japan, Germany, and the UK combined. So obviously some serious money being spent online, and this will continue to grow further year over year. The second metric we like to look at is how many people are using the internet globally. And right now it's about 4.4 billion. And that backs into almost a 60% global population penetration. And that is also on the rise. In fact, if you look at January 2018 to January 2019, over 367 million new users came online. That is over 1 million new users per day. And as you can imagine, fraudsters are salivating at this. So this is definitely a growing problem. So not only is a lot of money being spent, a lot of people are jumping on board, but people are increasing the amount of time that they spend daily online. And this is across all devices, but currently globally, the average is 6.25 hours that people are spending online. So you really have almost a quarter of the day or half of the waking hours where fraudsters are active saying, hey, here's an opportunity to abstract someone's PII, go create a fake account or whatever means they choose to fraud you. But all three of these numbers are growing substantially year over year, month over day, or month over month and day over day, excuse me. So we're pretty much primed for a larger problem as the days go on. And we see this in the growth around the fraud that's out there, right? So obviously digital is a great way to do it. Dimi will dig into some of the ways that that's done. But to put it into context, typically what happens is data breaches are the catalyst for fraud. In fact, there's probably many people on this call whose data is on the dark web for sale at a very cheap cost, which fraudsters will then use to either open an account, somehow get into your bank, buy things with your credit card they've created based on your information. But that typically is the catalyst. And the estimates between 2018 and 2025 is there will be almost 150 billion customer records breached. If you look at 2018 alone, across many segments, Dunkin' Donuts, Quest Diagnostics, Facebook, you kind of go on and on the breaches, and there's not a ton that people can do about it because of the innovation of fraudsters. But you can't buy a cup of coffee or get a blood test without the fear of your information getting out into the wild for someone to use nefariously. So it definitely an increasing issue. In fact, if you look at 2017 alone, there were almost 1,600 breaches. And that's growing in 2018. It will continue to grow in 2019. So that we obviously have to put in a lot of work to stay ahead of these fraudsters and mitigate what they're doing with our personally identifiable information. So they typically start there. And what we're seeing is a pretty big influx into the mobile realm. So there's actually a large growth in mobile internet usage and app downloads. Bank accounts, depending on your health provider, your health information is within an app. It goes on and on. And so fraudsters rightfully are attacking this. So from 2017 to 2018, there was a 2x increase in the instance of mobile account takeover. So that came up to almost 700,000 mobile account takeovers. So again, just wanted to provide a bit of context around the issue that we're seeing, some of the growth behind it, and why people are coming to companies like Onfido and iovation to help solve this. This plays out in some of iovation's actual numbers that they've reported. If you look at between 116% growth over on the far right with identity mining and phishing, up to almost 450% growth with synthetic ID fraud, which typically is the most common type, fraud across the board is exploding. Again, there's multiple ways to mitigate it. We'll dig into that more, but huge increases in what we're seeing in terms of growth of fraud. People are fraudsters specifically are saying, hey, we've got your PII, we know you're online, we're innovative. This is beautiful. They're super excited about this. In fact, what DJ mentioned at the beginning about how fraud is becoming really more of a job, there's actually a correlation between standard productivity hours for a typical corporate citizen and a fraudster. They tend to take Saturdays and Sundays off. Tuesday and Wednesday are the most productive for them. So this really is becoming a full-time job, which is super interesting, and it is also super dangerous. So I will pass to Dimi now to talk a little bit more about the specifics of what we're seeing.
Hi, everybody. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Dimitri Radu, and I'm a document and fraud specialist here at Onfido. Thank you all for joining. And today I'd like to hopefully scare you a little, but also give you a little bit of hope, because technology is evolving on both sides. Just as we are today using these fancy computers to log in and talk to each other at a moment's notice, so fraudsters are using these new technologies to try and trick us and fool us out of our hard-earned money. Now, the first image that you might see on the far left side, which looks like a very cute, lovely little girl, is actually a 40-year-old male wearing a latex mask. And if that image doesn't make you stop in your tracks, please pay attention to the image on the far right, where we have a screenshot of the types of documents that you can buy online. Now, this is just a tight crop, but it doesn't show the actual breadth of documents you can buy, which are very believable. And right down the middle, we see where these two come together. On one side, you have very sophisticated techniques, and on the other hand, you have the ubiquity or the great ease of access to these fake materials. And with the advent of mobile technology, that becomes easier to incorporate. Now, we, as a team, were fortunate enough to meet with the granddaddy of all fraud, Mr. Frank Abagnale, and we've spoken to him at an event. We asked him, how much easier would it be to commit fraud today compared to back in the 1950s when he was making checks? And he laughed us out of the room, and he said it would be at least 40 times, if not 400,000 times easier to do all of the fraudulent activity that he was doing, and he wouldn't get caught. Which maybe sounds a little cocky coming from him, but I'll give it to him since he did manage to make himself well known for that specific type of activity. Furthermore, what you should be aware of is that technology in these days has been used both by the fraudsters and the people trying to stop them to a similar extent. I've recently read an article about dark web websites using machine learning to prevent officials buying items, let's call them that, off the dark web for the purpose of tracking. So even the fraudsters are using machine learning. What are you doing? On that note, some of these IDs come in very low, entry level, as you can probably see, $35 for a very cheap, very easy one. Probably won't fool a lot of people, but at the very end of the spectrum, we have the highly sophisticated fakes, and those ones for the documents paired with latex masks and so on are so good they are almost impossible to catch without the proper training and the proper tooling. Now, I'd like to tell you about some of the common types of attacks that we see with our system. Here at Onfido, we usually leverage documents to be able to determine someone's identity. Government-issued documents usually help us do that. The types of abuses we see in these documents fall into two large categories. It would either be a single source or a multiple source. And I'm thinking about, where does the data come from and where do the images come from? The first level, which is the single source, as you can probably tell, you would get an existing document, say a driver's license, and you would go into any graphical editing software and shift your date of birth over by a day or by a month, or just change your address slightly. Now, for most people, that would not make a big difference, but this allows for the creation of heaps and heaps of synthetic identities, which all have one thing in common: they're believable. And as long as they can cast a shadow of a doubt, that's how they get in. That's how fraudsters abuse your system whenever you're unsure. At the bottom, we have another alternative to this: multiple sources, where, let's say, between all of the data breaches and all of the pictures and selfies that you post on your own social media, those pieces of information can be easily pieced together and stitched, if you like, to create a very believable document which would portray to be yours. So you could either, as a fraudster, take your own face and put it on an existing document, or take some other person, a victim's face, and put it onto your document with your personal details, and then the authorities would end up looking for the wrong person. So it's actually quite scary how low the barrier of entry is when it comes to committing organized frauds and patterns of attack. So to that extent, I wanted to quickly show you how easy it would be to fool a database. Now, on the first line of this table, we have the original name of a person that happens to be living in Cologne, Germany. And as you can tell, on line number 2, we've done one small phonetic change and slightly edited the date of birth and added the full name of the address. Now, between line 1 and line 2, you will probably get a partial database match against one of your CRAs or credit reference agencies, providers that would allow you to look up a database. And then line number 3 is another small variation, and line number 4 is another variation. And then beyond that, you can easily tell how you can accumulate multiple records which all have a partial pass against the credit reference agency. And this is to say, if you can slightly change your name in a form, well, you can copy that one character from your name and shift it over, or copy that one piece of one number from your date of birth to your month of birth. And this highlights the vulnerability that we have when relying simply on database checks. Now, going forward, I did tell you quite a bit about the fact that we use documents to check if a person has a legal authority or legal right to access a service. Now, for most of you, I'm sure you might not be familiar with the Swedish passport unless you happen to hold one, in which case, congratulations. I hear it's one of the happiest places to live in the world. But this document, looking at it straight out, it appears convincing. It appears genuine. You would look at it and it seems to have the right hologram. It has the holder's name. It has a signature that looks legitimate rather than one of those computer-generated fonts and so on. So you would be kind of at a miss and say, yeah, I think this one's okay. But imagine that 5 minutes after you approve this one customer, you get another application with another Swiss passport. Now, some of you might be having a sense of déjà vu, and I commend you. The personal information on the second document is identical to the one on the first one. The only difference is that another face has been applied into this document. And this goes on to show us that a fraudster will create a template of a document, and sometimes they won't even bother to change the personal details when they sell it to some other poor person that is trying to, for example, escape an unfortunate circumstance, or straight up trying to commit fraud. Now, the same type of activity where fraudsters create patterns of attack by making one template and then adjusting it and adapting it for each one of their use case is something that we've tried to reproduce at Onfido, where we have tried to reverse engineer a large majority of the templates that we found being pushed out by these rings of organized fraud, and we've managed to find the tells, if you'd like, of those specific templates. And that's how we stay one step ahead. We try and deconstruct these organized crime rings and see where are they failing. But the fun part is it's always moving forward. So if this one ring of counterfeiters today has this one tell on their document, maybe tomorrow they'll figure out what that was and they'll close that gap. So you will no longer be able to leverage that indicator to find if a document is fraudulent. Now, I've been telling you a lot about documents, but that's not everything that Onfido does. Actually, we do offer a biometric solution as well, and together with our partners from iovation, we understand that the space is much broader than just the solution that we are behind. And as always, there are options of what you can select or what you can pick and choose and match together to get the best experience for your user, the best cost for your stakeholders, the largest reliability for your fraud prevention teams, and also something that scales as you globally move into wider geographies, which is a big thing for a lot of the new up-and-comers in the global and the sharing economy. On one side of the spectrum, you may have biometric enrollment or biometric validation or verification, which is quite reliable. It's quite ubiquitous because most people have fingerprints and faces and irises, but the user experience can be cumbersome. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, like we mentioned earlier, we have databases, which may be unreliable, both by virtue of how they store this information and how matches work, partially or fully, as well as through all of the data breaches that Kevin has mentioned earlier. So while the user experience is fantastic, all you have to do is type in your name, date of birth, and address. The reliability on the other spectrum is not the best. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Scott from iovation, who will tell us more about creating digital keys for business.
Thank you very much, Dimi. Yeah, I'm very happy to speak to this topic, and especially with respect to verifying consumer identities in a digital world, because you're not having that face-to-face interaction. And so as you think about this, the identifier in your wallet is an anchor of recognizing individuals and verifying an identity. But in today's environment, there's another device that is equally important, and that is the phone in your pocket or in your pocketbook. And that's where we get involved, is in that digital identifier and all of the things that you can learn from the devices that consumers use. So for iovation, we bring an intelligence to the devices that are used by consumers. So if it's a device that's used by a consumer that they use to purchase goods, to interact online, we can recognize it. We can recognize it not only at your own site when it returns, but across multiple sites, so that we can benefit from that long-term good history of good consumers, or identifying fraudsters that are targeting the retail industry, for example. If you go to the next slide. So it's always about who's behind that device. But one of the first things that you can see is that you begin to get a lot of information just from the devices that consumers use. So you don't necessarily need to know that identifier right off the bat to understand risk. It could be geolocation risk. It can be, are they masking or changing their device attributes? For example, are they using an emulator? Are they going through an anonymizing proxy? And we are able to understand risk characteristics of the devices, as well as map those different devices that good consumers use, as well as fraudsters, to access different accounts. And if you go to the next slide, based on that experience with them, we can actually group them together to identify, in our view of the world, anonymous individuals. So we can actually create virtual consumer records in the iovation platform tied to the devices, the activities that we've seen from consumers, their risk characteristics of those devices themselves, and their reputation and history online. We provide a mechanism for our customers to submit bad experiences that they've had with consumers, so that when they come in with a new identity, we recognize that they're using the same device, and that we can actually say, okay, they've been reported for credit fraud or identity theft, and not allow them to create a new account or make a purchase. And so those are things where we are actually actively using that intelligence from those devices that consumers use to map them to anonymous individuals and help guide the decisions that you make online, whether that you allow them to create an account or make a purchase. If you go to the next slide. And what's great about this is that if you look at every interaction you have with consumers online, there are insights that you can get. It may start from the moment that they open their account, but it can also be applied at the time that they log into that account, whether they make a change to their email or phone number, when they're making a purchase or a payment. Their device can even be an important identifier when they call into the contact center. So you can use your mobile app as a mechanism for authorizing changes on their account or answering questions that they may have, or reservations or bookings. So all along that customer journey, that digital insight can really enrich and enhance your ability to positively authenticate that individual. And so at this point, though, I'm going to hand it back to talk a little bit about how iovation and Onfido together bring together that digital identity, that personal identity. And so when you're thinking about it, it's the ID in your wallet and the phone in your pocket. And those are two powerful instruments you have for reducing the risk of your interactions with consumers.
Great, thank you, Scott. It's, that piece about identifying the user behind the screen really hits home. It's something we hear often, and it's really a vital element in building this trusted and secure connection, both for you, the provider, as well as your user. So you're really protecting both sides of the coin there. In fact, if you look at it, and again, what we hear from the field and from our clients is that the key to maximizing their digital channels is to balance, one, these secure connections, with two, a streamlined and intuitive customer journey, where you really don't need to be concerned with who's behind that device because you've already identified any potential threat. And a major issue that we hear of that really isn't discussed enough is that this increasing consumer demand for speed and ease of use. I like the term Amazonification, big buttons, bright colors, a couple clicks and you're done. That creates a very, very short window to optimize trust and a short window to optimize safety and security. And that goes across any given workflow. So there's this shrinking period of time where us as providers of a service, we don't have much time to identify them without the risk of them dropping off, which obviously has an impact to revenue. So what ends up happening is that more often than we'd like to think, unfortunately, this drives some companies to provide the perception of security rather than a truly safe and secure experience. So they're saying, hey, we look secure, but is it actually secure? So to solve for this, most of our successful clients will combine a minimal amount of friction, right? If you look down, there was a big PwC study done recently, and it showed that 89% of people believe that, specifically in the sharing economy, but actually more broadly based as well, that digital interactions are based on trust between providers and the user. It's trust, trust, trust. That's the key. So if you can combine a little bit of friction that shows the user, hey, trust is being taken seriously here, and combine that with some of the, that back end analysis that Scott was mentioning, kind of these invisible fraud vectors on the back end, and you find that through device profiling, that's really the secret sauce to what we're hearing out in the field that's really working for people. And again, they're protecting themselves and their clients, but they're also maintaining this solid UX where they're not getting drop off. And so they're maximizing their revenue. So what we're hearing is that most will start with device profiling, with an iovation in this case. And they'll do one of two things, right? They'll run device profiling, they'll run iovation. That spits out a score, a confidence score of, is this person fraudulent or not? Based on that, they may run ID verification or ID proofing with some sort of government issued document based on that resulting score. So if that score isn't high enough or there's not enough confidence, it automatically kicks off the ID proofing or ID verification process, or they will run both device profiling and ID proofing at the same time. So it's really up to the client, which they'd like to do. We can accommodate both and we can customize that. But when these two tactics, these fraud mitigation tactics are used and they really underpin this intuitive journey for the end user, you do get the end goal and you achieve that where the end user feels secure, they actually are secure, and you're protecting your business while maximizing your revenue. And we're seeing an increase in this across all industries, from financial services to the demand sharing and gig economies, to insurance, to healthcare, to telco. It really is starting to kind of span the entire spectrum, which is great, and people are seeing a lot of success behind it. So, real quick overview to kind of bring it home. It's really about combining ID proofing and device profiling. Again, you're getting that visual, hey, security is being taken seriously. This is pretty slick. It's innovative. It's intuitive. It didn't take me long at all. I didn't have to drop off because I'm not frustrated. Plus, device profiling is running in the background to analyze what Scott was mentioning. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, which is fantastic. And what we're seeing in the field is, if I could draw your attention to the results side on the right side of the screen, this is an aggregate across hundreds of customers, but on average, there's typically a 20 to 25% decrease in fraud attempts, because that visual piece of, hey, security is being taken seriously, I have to submit my face and my ID, chases a good amount of people away. You're seeing about the same percentage of decrease in user drop-off rates during registration, simply because the focus is on the streamlined UX and UI. It happens quick, it's innovative, it's kind of slick. A lot of people actually enjoy it because it's kind of cool and it's done very quickly. But then you start to increase those percentages and you get to almost a 40% increase in verified users. And we're hearing a substantial increase to a company's top and bottom lines in their revenue, because they're not chasing away the good people but they are chasing away the bad actors. So you're getting the right users of your service that you're letting through and keeping out the fraudsters. There's a big brand image and awareness play here. You know, it seems like it's daily that another big brand has suffered some sort of hack, some sort of breach, some sort of fraudulent activity where there's a big issue. And with today's social media and the access to information, everyone finds out about it. And so specifically with us, it's iovation plus Onfido, but you know, more broadly, it's really ID proofing plus device profiling. That's where we're really hearing the home run is. And it's surpassing people's expectations. They're fundamentally changing their business. So we're happy to provide more information on that if you'd like to reach out. So to bring it home here, there's really 5 main tips that, again, we've brought from the field and from our combined clients that we're hearing. And one, pretty simple, decrease the false rejection rate, right? That means let's let the good ones in. Let's not turn away the right people. And let's let them, you know, spend money on our marketplace, sign up for a bank account, whatever it may be. The second is to decrease the false acceptance rate. So we're keeping the bad actors out. This is huge. There's a massive monetary cost both to the consumer and to the provider if this is not done. And third, it has to be what I think the most trendier keyword recently is delightful experience, right? I mentioned it as the Amazonification, but it has to be easy. It has to flow. There can't be large delays. And it has to be intuitive. And so there's a big focus on both companies, iovation and Onfido, to support our clients in building out their own UX that does support this. And what this results in is you know, an adherence to the focus on protecting your members and your business. It's massive, especially in a crowded market. If you look at, you know, down to the granular level of DevOps and spinning up AWS or Azure servers with CI/CD and microservices and all these things, it's easy. Or at least much easier day by day to spin up a business. And so we're seeing very crowded markets in digital environments across all verticals, and you really have to differentiate. Plus, you can't really slip up on protection or else they'll go somewhere else. And then finally, what we're hearing is that people are leveraging an integration between, again, in this case, Onfido and iovation, but ID proofing and device profiling with those 2 use cases I mentioned, either, you know, running both of those with every provider or user that comes on, or allowing the device profiling score to kick off a potential ID proofing flow. So just some tips and tricks that we're hearing out in the field. Hopefully that's helpful. And I will pause here and I will pass back to DJ for some questions that I think we've received over the presentation.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of the panelists. That was great. Some great information there. We do have some questions that came in. We'll spend the next few minutes going over those. If you have any, please, again, use the questions tab in your webinar software to ask them. If we don't get to your question on the webinar itself, somebody definitely will get back to you offline and answer your question. So first up, someone was looking for an example of or 2 of a fraud ring that you might have detected. It says, what are 1 or 2 examples of fraud rings that you have detected and addressed, and what made them sophisticated?
Okay, well, first of all, that's a fantastic question. The proof is always in the pudding. Unless you can talk about what you've actually done, it's just words. Funnily enough, there have been a few rings of sophisticated fraudsters here at home in the UK that we've managed to tackle. And these have been, well, actually, I'll go through the 2 cases that are just off the top of my head. The first one was a case for a very sophisticated manufacturer that was creating fake UK driving licenses and shipping them over from China in massive blocks. Now what we've done is we've identified that within these documents they had some the government had put in some very small, we call them deliberate errors, where to the untrained eye everything looks normal, but to a trained specialist and to the algorithms that we use, you would be able to notice, for example, that the slant of a slash between the month and the date has the wrong angle. It's meant to be 35 degrees or 27 degrees, and in that case it was 45 degrees. So nearly imperceptible to the human eye, but that was something that we found through a community that shared fraud intelligence to protect its user base. We found these examples of fraudulent UK driving licenses. We deconstructed them to find what indicators we could find, and the one I can tell you about is the angle of the slash between the dates. The other one example, which is from a slightly different domain, was a website which we found online to be selling Photoshop templates of British passports. Now, what we've done is we've reversed engineered the template, the Photoshop template being sold online, and we found traces or indicators in all of the people using a document sourced from that website. So then what we could do is we could reference the fact that we've identified that specific route, or let's call it seed source of fraud. And by reverse engineering that one, we were able to then find larger networks within our system and stop them.
All right. That's a pretty interesting piece of information that you run into when you're doing that sort of thing. So thank you for that, Dimi. So one of the frustrations that I hear a lot from people is the fact that they can't get law enforcement to listen to them. And somebody has chimed in with a question in a few parts. I just want to ask, and it has to do with that. It says, once you identify a fraud ring, what are the next steps or the best steps to pursue prosecution? Do you guys have any insight on that?
Maybe I can jump in here a little bit. First of all, it's difficult because a lot of times the people committing the fraud are not in the jurisdiction of the companies that is being targeted. So that's always difficult, but you can work with local law enforcement that can coordinate across country boundaries to pursue these bad actors. And in fact, sometimes iovation has worked on behalf to provide device information and confirmation and pursuing and rooting out these fraud rings. As an example, we worked with a large insurance company to bust up a ghost broking ring where the devices that they were using as a part of this ring were a main piece of the evidence that was used in apprehending them as well as charging them. So what I would recommend is that that you do pursue it, that you work with your local law enforcement. I guess the primary challenges are when they're distributed all around the world. Don't know, Kevin or Dimi, if you have something else to add there.
Yeah, real quick, I think, in our case at iovation and Onfido, we're lucky enough to have some subject matter experts that can really support and help this. For example, at iovation, I know that there's a member of the team with a deep military intelligence background who is very, very adept to catching fraudsters and working with law enforcement. At Onfido, Dimi and his team, they'll do things like they actually train Interpol. So there's tight relationships there. So I think leveraging the subject matter experts and the relationships that we have internally is also super valuable.
Okay.
One final point. I'm sure that depending on the local regulation, each one of our listeners will have their government guidance on how to respond to fraud, whether that's a suspicious activity report or any other kind of mitigating factors that they need to do. But again, this applies locally to each jurisdiction, as Scott mentioned.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for that. Another one has come in from our audience, and it says, regarding document verification, how much machine learning is used compared to a document expert analyst in the back? How is the UX regarding to the time involved in this document verification? That's the second part of it. I'm not sure about that, but at least we can talk about that first part. In the system, how much is technology and how much is human?
Again, that is a very good question. It signifies that you understand your problem space quite well. The short answer is it depends on your document type and your risk profile. One thing to note would be that not all documents are created equally. There are over 4,500 1,000 different identity documents across the world, and some of them are very secure and quite easy to verify in an automated fashion, and some of them aren't. So the proportion of checks that can be automated to a high level of let's call it assurance depends on the geography that you're working in. And I'll just give you one short and sweet example. If I'm a fraudster, let's say if I want to get into a bar and drink, and I happen to be underage and I live in California, I will never go to the bar with a Californian driving license that's fake, because I'm in California. It's most likely they will know what the Californian driving license has as security elements. So if you get a document in a country or in a state where it doesn't belong, that automatically increases its profile risk, and that then can be treated as a slightly different use case. And that's where you have your smart rules that you can put in place so that the checks or the documents that come from risky geographies or that have poor manufacturing systems can be made to go through more of an expert review, as opposed to the ones that are less risky and more prone to being used in the correct way. For example, the previous version of the Chinese passport, not very secure. There's a lot of counterfeits of those in the market. The current version of the Chinese passport, extremely secure, very, very hard to reproduce, very, very few fakes of that hanging around. So it depends on the profile of the document. That is the short answer.
All right. One thing when I talk to folks in this industry, one thing that comes up a lot is that the fraud department in general is kind of looked at as someone that inhibits revenue, someone that says no a lot. We have a question that came in that says, how can fraud prevention benefit your business versus being simply a cost of business?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in on that one. One of the things that I would just ask people to really consider is how much today consumer trust is becoming a true competitive advantage. And a lot of times people speak to experience and customer experience, and there's no doubt that that's essential. I mean, the customer experience that consumers have online is driving who they do business with. They'll switch if they don't have a good experience, but trust has become equally important. If you actually look at Apple's recent campaigns around privacy, I think this underlines how critical that consumer trust is. And so if you look at things like locking your credit accounts, that actually makes it harder to apply for a loan or apply for credit, yet people do it. So to the extent that you use strong controls at the appropriate times to both protect consumer identities from identity theft, as well as protect their accounts that are existing from being taken over and abused, then you're going to build that relationship of trust with consumers, and that absolutely can be a long-term competitive advantage in that relationship you have with your customers.
Fantastic. All right. We are coming up against a quarter to the hour, so we are going to stop it right there. If someone has asked a question and it has not been answered, as I mentioned, someone from Onfido will get back to you personally to answer your question. And as I also mentioned, if you missed any portion of this webinar, you can go back and check out the recording when it's posted on Card Not Present. We will let you know when that happens. I want to thank Kevin and Dimi and Scott for a great presentation. I want to thank everybody in the audience that joined us and stuck with us for this long. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.